First of all, thank you, VanBrewers, for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back with the VanBrewers again. I was actually one of the early members of the VanBrewers about 10 years ago when the club started up. And shortly after, I actually started working for a Salt Spring Brewery and then moved out to Montreal and worked as a brewer here for about 6 years. Before starting work with Lallemand, first in the R&D lab, and now more recently as a technical advisor for the global brewing team and sales manager responsible for Canada. I'm going to talk a bit about dry beer yeast production and quality control. So a lot of home brewers have seen commercial breweries. Very few people have seen the inside of a yeast plant. And dry yeast production is significantly different from liquid yeast production. So I'll show you some pictures of the equipment, explain a bit about the process. And if you ever get a chance to come out to Montreal, maybe I could arrange to give you a tour of the plant here in Montreal as well. Yeah, so let's get started. All right, so at Lallemand, there's a fairly substantial yeast culture collection. There's over 3,500 strains in the collection, about 400 of which are in commercial production on a regular basis. This is spread between all of our different business units: brewing, enology, baking, distilling, animal nutrition, and downstream processing for nutrients and bioingredients and yeast extracts and things like that. The cultures are stored in 2 different formats and under liquid nitrogen, as well as in a microbank at -80. These are freezers that are under lock and key with only very few people having access to them. That's to protect the collection. There's several copies of the collection kept in different locations in case the building burns down or something like that. And by storing it in this way, the yeast cultures, the integrity of the strains remain intact essentially indefinitely. You could see here an example. There's a vial that can be kept in the freezer. There's a little ceramic bead that is porous. The yeast is infused into that ceramic bead, and every time they have to go back into the freezer to make up a new working stock of a strain, that bead is inoculated onto a plate, and that plate is used to propagate up the yeast and create working stocks that will be used for future productions. We do a general characterization of all of the strains, including a genetic profile, the sugars that are consumed by each strain, killer factor positive or negative, POF positive or negative, POF being a phenolic off flavor. And we screen different strains for whether they might be useful in different business units as well for different applications. Okay, so giving a brief overview of what happens in yeast propagation. So it starts in the lab. All yeast produced by Lallemand for all of the different business units all over the world start at the R&D lab in Montreal. The lab will produce a slant, which is basically an agar media in a test tube with some biomass of yeast grown on the surface. That slant is sent to the production facility. It's used to inoculate a lab culture in liquid media. And there's 3 culture steps that go into progressively larger volumes in larger and larger flasks. After the 3rd lab culture step, the culture is inoculated into a pre-culture step in a small scale fermenter. In this step, molasses, water, and nutrients are added. For dry yeast, molasses is used as the carbon source, the sugar source, as opposed to malt. And there's a reason for that, which I will get into. The pre-culture is used to inoculate a seed culture. The seed yeast is concentrated and washed in a separating machine, which is basically a centrifuge similar to what you'd find in a commercial brewery. The only difference is that we're collecting the solids, whereas in a brewery they would be spitting them out into the drain and keeping the clear beer. The opposite is the case for yeast propagation. The spent molasses and alcohol and salts and vitamins and things like that would be thrown off, and we keep a concentrated yeast slurry. That yeast is kept in a receiving tank, and that acts as the seed for multiple commercial fermentations. During the commercial fermentations, it's similar to a seed fermentation. The only difference is that after a commercial fermentation, it's sent to a separator and then to a receiving vessel and then to a dryer afterwards. So seed yeast become the seed for a commercial fermentation. A commercial fermentation gets dried and becomes a commercial dried yeast. Part of the difference between liquid yeast production and dry yeast production is the sugar source. Dry yeast production uses molasses, whereas liquid yeast production typically is grown on wort. The main difference when you use molasses is it allows you to do a fed batch propagation. So if you have all of the sugar, all of the nutrients present at the beginning of the fermentation, the yeast will multiply in a similar way that it would for a beer fermentation, producing alcohol. But we don't want to make a beer with this yeast during propagation. We want to maximize the yeast yield. And you do that by limiting the ethanol concentration. And the way you limit the ethanol concentration is by limiting the sugar. This is for those that are interested in the science behind it, it's referred to as the Crabtree effect. So when a culture is initially inoculated, there's a certain amount of sugar. As the sugar is consumed, ethanol will increase. When the sugar is reduced to a minimum, under aerobic conditions, the ethanol will begin to be consumed by the yeast as well. At that point, the yeast concentration will be maximized. The yeast will multiply more efficiently under aerobic conditions where both sugar and ethanol are at a minimum, and molasses are fed gradually throughout the propagation so that the sugar concentrations never reach a point where the yeast starts to flip back into fermentation mode, producing alcohol instead of more yeast cells. So after the fermentations, the commercial fermentation is held in a receiving tank and then sent to what's referred to as an RVF. That stands for rotary vacuum filter. It's basically a huge turning drum, and it's under vacuum. So the surface around the entire drum is under vacuum, and as it turns, there's a cream yeast, liquid cream yeast container at the bottom of the drum that is continually wetting the surface of the drum as it turns. As it turns around, it will be scraped off as it turns around, the water is filtered out of the yeast, leaving a concentrated yeast cake on the outside of the drum. As it gets to the other side, it's cut off with a knife. So I'll show a picture of that here. That's me at the brewing yeast production plant in Vienna. You can see the RVF they have here as it's turning around. The yeast cake is scraped off in large sheets on the other side of the drum. So it's a continuous filtration process. There's never, it's only ever a very thin layer that gets scraped off continually. After that yeast cake is scraped off, it is run into an extruder. The yeast cake is extruded into a 0.2 millimeter spaghetti. In the R&D lab in Montreal, when they do small scale propagations for new strains to optimize the process and recipes for propagation, they actually use literally a consumer spaghetti mill. It's basically the same thing in the yeast plant, except a lot bigger. So the yeast is extruded through a screen into a very small spaghetti, and then runs up a conveyor belt and down into a dryer. When the yeast spaghetti hits the dryer, it breaks into very small pieces, which is why dry yeast has a slightly elongated rod shape in its dry form. That's because in the step just before it was a long yeast spaghetti. This is a picture of the dryer. Uh, it's a fluid bed dryer, which means that warm air is pushed into the bottom of the bed. On the inside of the drum, there's a quantity of the yeast spaghetti. As the air is pushed up, the yeast circulates around into the chamber. We measure the temperature very precisely to know when the moisture level has reached its appropriate level of around 95% dry mass. At that point, the drying is stopped and the yeast is taken out of the dryer. For each fermentation, for each propagation of yeast, there's multiple batches of drying, which is why you may sometimes see a slight salt and pepper character to the yeast. Some particles are slightly darker, some particles are a little bit lighter. That's related to a little bit of variation in the drying process from batch to batch. Multiple drying batches are blended together in the final product, and you sometimes see a little bit of color variation there as well. It usually doesn't affect the quality of the yeast, and that's always confirmed in the lab through our QC program. Typical analysis for dry beer yeast is about 93 to 95% dry mass. Living yeast cells are, for most strains, greater than 5 times 10 to the 9 viable cells per gram. Wild yeast is less than 1 wild yeast cell per million viable brewing yeast cells, and that's measured using a lysine method. So that's less than 0.0001% of total yeast is wild yeast. Bacteria is less than 1 per million brewing yeast cells. And just to put this into a context, this is dry yeast. I remember when I started in home brewing, I was told that dry yeast was not as good as liquid yeast. Our specifications are equal or greater than liquid yeast producers. So in terms of contamination, there's really no difference between dry yeast and liquid yeast in terms of potential for contamination. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about our QC program and how we maintain and measure the quality of our yeast. As part of our quality control program after production and packaging, we measure viability, the vitality of the yeast by using a cleaning test where we look at how quickly the yeast is able to start fermenting a sugar sample. We test for the presence of wild yeast and bacteria through different microbiology methods like plating. We measure the fermentation performance in the R&D lab in Montreal. And that's done in these tall EBC tubes. EBC stands for European Brewing Convention. These are standard fermentation tubes. The tall geometry is required to give enough convection currents to keep the beer mixing during fermentation. If you try to do a very small scale, small volume fermentation in a mason jar, for example, the geometry of the mason jar won't allow for convection currents. The yeast may flocculate prematurely, and the fermentation performance won't be representative of what you would see in a larger scale fermentation. So these allow us to, these are a 2-liter volume, they're jacketed. We can cool as well as heat the fermentation. We even are able to heat up to 40 degrees to do test fermentations for our new Voss Kveik yeast. Fermentation volume is 1.6 liters. We take samples about midway through the fermenter volume, measuring density and pH daily. And that's how we measure the fermentation performance. We will bottle and taste the beer from each and every yeast production to make sure that the yeast is it's producing a flavor profile that is consistent with that strain. We also look for potential off flavors that might make us go back and look at the bacteria and wild yeast contamination data to make sure that there's no potential for contamination there. Lallemand was the first company to measure the genetic profile of each and every production as a part of our quality control. That's what we see here. Each and every strain has a unique genetic fingerprint, so we can confirm after the production that the right yeast was produced. It happens very rarely that flasks get mixed up in the production facility and baking yeast ends up being dried and sent to the brewing plant. So that we would catch that by looking at the genetic profile. Sampling for QC, we test 1 500-gram brick per layer per pallet to ensure quality, which is a lot of yeast to be sent to the QC lab. It's a lot of yeast waste that goes into our QC program. Each and every brick, which for a propagation of several tons of dry yeast per fermentation, that's a lot of bricks to check. We make sure that a proper vacuum seal is achieved on each and every brick prior to shipping to our distributors. So we test a lot of yeast. Due to the stability of dry yeast, we're able to save retention samples. This isn't possible for liquid yeast. Liquid yeast is not stable. They need to get it out of the door as quickly as possible to make sure that it's as viable as possible in the consumer's hands. Dry yeast is very stable. Even room temperature samples, we recommend storing under vacuum in a fridge, but even room temperature retention samples, when we test them several years later, don't show a significant drop in viability or vitality. This means that we're allowed to wait for a full QC results before shipping, which sometimes takes several weeks to go back and test and retest data to make sure that there's no contamination above specifications, to make sure that performance is as it should be. And it allows us to do these test fermentations for each and every batch, which wouldn't be possible for liquid yeast. We save retention samples, which means that as a commercial brewer or even as a home brewer, if you have problems with performance, you can send me an email, and any email that goes to the Lallemand, or to the brewing@lallemand.com email address comes to me. If you have any concerns about a specific lot, we could potentially go back, pull out our retention samples from that specific production lot, even 1 or 2 years later when you finally use the product, and make sure that there's no issues with contamination of that lot or performance. So QC program, we've made significant efforts to improve our testing for Diastaticus yeast. So Diastaticus yeast is a variant of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's not a different species. By definition, Diastaticus yeast is just a regular brewing yeast that possesses a single gene, the STA1 gene. There's actually a family of genes, STA1, STA2, STA3. It's a glucoamylase gene that's able to break down dextrins and starch into fermentable sugars that will reduce the body and increase the attenuation of that strain. Yeah, so the enzyme is thermostable. It's active even after pasteurization, which means that it's a significant concern for packaging beer for commercial breweries. Additional fermentation of a finished packaged beer can result in overcarbonation, foamy beer, your beer being out of spec, higher alcohol, lower sugars. The flavor may not be on brand for that particular product. In worst cases, it could result in exploding cans as well as expensive recalls and possibly lawsuits. And I find this really interesting because when I was with the Vanbrewers 10 years ago, before I started brewing professionally and working for Lallemand, Diastaticus wasn't even on our radar. Nobody was talking about Diastaticus. And it's not because nobody was using Diastaticus strains. Traditional Saison strains and a few other commercial brewing strains have always been diastaticus. We just weren't really aware of the mechanisms and how that was happening. So yeast producers have made significant efforts to improve their testing for diastaticus. The most common method for testing diastaticus strains is through PCR. This is a genetic test to detect the presence or absence of the STA1 glucoamylase gene. There's commercial versions of PCR kits, the PAL Gene Disc, Invisible, Sentinel. There's a few others as well that are commonly used to simplify the PCR detection in a commercial brewery setting. The problem with PCR detection is that it has its limitations. If you do a dilution of a yeast sample, so when we start with dry beer yeast, let's say the commercial production has around 10 to the 10 viable yeast cells. If we do a dilution of that yeast and do PCR on that sample, we would find that if we dilute if we dilute the diastaticus yeast in the context of a concentrated dry yeast production, you see that as we dilute the amount of diastaticus in the sample, we reach a point where we can't detect it anymore. So at this point, we're barely able to detect it at a dilution of 10 to the 5. If we start with, that means that we can detect a 5 log difference. That's 1 in 100,000 yeast cells. That means that in the context of a beer, a yeast production, a yeast sample that has 10 to the 10 viable yeast cells per gram, you would still have 100,000 diastaticus cells per gram of dry yeast. And less than that, 10,000, 1,000 diastaticus cells per gram would not be detectable by PCR methods. This is true in our R&D labs. This is true of any commercial PCR detection kit for diastaticus. So what do we do? If you have 1,000 diastaticus cells per gram of dry yeast, it's going to cause problems in your beer, potential for over attenuation. You can use Durham tubes. A Durham tube is basically a traditional test tube that has an inverted glass tube on the inside of the larger test tube. After you autoclave the sample, the bubble is eliminated from the inverted tube on the inside. And the liquid media that we have here is essentially autoclaved Budweiser or any other neutral, fully attenuated beer that has nothing but dextrins left as a sugar source. All fermentable sugars have been fully fermented. What we see is that in the presence of a diastaticus yeast strain, the dextrins that are present in this finished beer will be broken down into fermentable sugars and consumed. Through the fermentation activity, you see the formation of a bubble on the inside of the inverted tube, on the inside of the Durham tube. So you see here on the left, there's Windsor, which is a non-diastaticus yeast strain. Belle Saison is a diastaticus positive strain. You see bubbles in all of the tubes with the Belle Saison and no bubbles for Windsor. When we do a dilution of Belle Saison in the context of a large concentration of Windsor cells, so adding a small dilution of diastaticus to a non-diastaticus strain, we see that a Durham tube in this context is able to detect here as low as 10 diastaticus cells per gram per 10 to the 10 of Windsor, which is a non-diastaticus strain. which is increased sensitivity to 8 log difference, as opposed to the 5 log difference that you would see in a typical PCR test. So durum tubes have the potential to be much more sensitive than a traditional PCR. PCR is quicker. Durum tubes will be more sensitive. The problem with durum tubes is they take a long time, up to 2 weeks, to see a positive result with a very small number of cells. This is another area where dry yeast has an advantage because we're under no rush to get the yeast out the door and to our distributors. We can hold it back, wait those few weeks to make sure that there's no diastaticus activity at all in the yeast before we ship it out. This is more of an issue for anybody working in a QC lab. Not necessarily relevant for home brewers, but dry yeast does have a small false positive rate due to the consumption of internal sugars within the dry yeast. Dry yeast has some sugar reserves, such as glycogen, in its dry form, so it's able to start fermenting very quickly, whereas liquid cultures tend to be starved at the end of a liquid yeast fermentation. So there's no fermentable sugars or glycogen reserves in those yeast. Dry yeast will consume a bit of its own internal sugars and produce a very small bubble, even in the presence of pure water, where there's no fermentable sugars present. There's a few other methods. I won't go into too much detail here, but copper sulfate media at high concentrations can be used to detect, to inhibit traditional brewing strains. Diastaticus strains such as Belle Saison will still grow in the presence of higher concentrations of copper sulfate. And other wild yeast strains such as baking yeast, wine yeast do not grow in higher concentrations of copper sulfate either. At Lallemand, we have a series of best practices, one of which is diastaticus, but we have many other best practice documents available for different applications. If you have any questions about really anything related to beer fermentations, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to send you any best practice documents that we have. As I mentioned, I'm the one that receives any of the questions for the brewing team, and I'm just as happy to respond to home brewer questions as I am to commercial brewers. So don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. In terms of diastaticus, the take-home message here is that there is no perfect test for all diastaticus strains. Sampling volume is an issue because in order to detect 10 cells per gram of dry yeast, you have to test a very large volume of dry yeast. If you're doing a DNA extraction from dry yeast, you use a very small quantity of yeast, not nearly a gram. So you're likely to miss those few contaminating cells. For that reason, negative PCR results can be misleading, and you should always assume that diastaticus could be the cause of over-attenuation until you have identified another cause for that problem. I'd like to say thank you to everybody. And again, please reach out for any questions that you might have. Lallemand Brewing, we're composed of, we have a pretty large international team. There's people from Australia, Europe, South America, Asia. That's all of us standing outside of our yeast plant in Vienna. We're all a very technical team with brewing background who have worked in the industry. We're not just salespeople. So we have a very large breadth of expertise to draw upon. If there's anything I don't have specific experience with, I reach out to the rest of our team and we'll get some answers for you. So with that, thank you again for having me here. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, there were a few questions in the chat. You might as well just ask them out loud. So Chad, do you want to go first with yours? Go ahead.
Sure, if you can hear me.
Yeah, you're good
Yeah,
now.
I was just wondering. I know that like there's some materials that end up looking like a fine powder that are made with a vacuum process, like a spray and a vacuum for drying. I wasn't sure if that was something that's been done for yeast or if that would hurt them.
Well, a spray dryer is typically used for inactivated yeast. So for producing yeast extracts for nutrients and things like that, or animal feed or things like that. Spray dryer is higher temperatures, so it will typically kill the yeast. Dry bacteria, on the other hand, will have a very fine powdery texture to it, but it's produced by a different mechanism altogether through, I believe it's lyophilizing, like a freeze drying process.
Cool, thanks.
Small question. If you use the dry yeast, is it better to, before you brew, to activate it, or can you just put it in the wort when the brewing is done?
Yeah, it's a great question. The science suggests that rehydrating or direct pitching into wort is stressful for the yeast. In practice, many brewers find that it doesn't make any difference at all. And that's true of Lallemand, that's true of Fermentis or any other dry yeast. It's not essential to rehydrate the yeast. We still recommend it as a first choice, but part of the issue is that improper rehydration could do more harm than good. So if it's just easier for your process, go ahead and dry pitch. I have no reservations about dry pitching any of our strains. We do see some strain specific differences, but the differences tend to be pretty small. From the Lallemand collection, the only strain that I would recommend still doing a proper rehydration is the diamond lager yeast. All
And
others tend to perform pretty well.
If you talk about
dry pitching.
differences, is it flavor-wise, or is it a stop fermentation or a slow fermentation, or what is the difference?
From what we've seen in the lab is there's not very much flavor difference.
Yeah.
Over the course of a year, for every yeast production we did both a dry pitched and rehydrated version of the fermentation in identical wort. In our tasting panel, most of the time there is not very much difference detected.
Mm.
Sometimes there was a slight preference for one or the other, but it wasn't consistent between direct pitching or rehydrated. We often actually see a slightly shorter lag phase when dry pitching as opposed to rehydrating. And I don't really understand the mechanism behind that. My personal theory, that hasn't been confirmed in the lab yet, is that so yeast will preferentially consume glucose and before it starts consuming maltose and maltotriose. I think that when yeast is direct pitched into wort that has a complex mix of sugars, some of the maltose and maltotriose may make it across the membrane during the rehydration process and activate those metabolic pathways for consuming those for consuming those sugars before the glucose is fully consumed. So you get a more complete start to fermentation by consuming glucose, maltose, and maltotriose right from the beginning. So we see a slightly shorter lag phase. Attenuation tends to be very similar. In a few cases, we see slightly better attenuation when dry pitching. That was true when we tested it for our New England strain.
Okay. Jeffrey, you want to ask yours?
You might still be on mute, Jeffrey. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so there was one part of your presentation there where you had those yeast spaghettis going up the conveyor.
Yeah.
So it looked like it was open. How do you guys avoid getting like contaminations dropping onto the conveyor line there?
That's a good question. Yeah, Well, it's a pretty clean facility. Everybody going in and walking around will be wearing protective gear, and hair nets and beard nets and things like that. Nobody is really walking on top of those conveyor belts. There's air filters on the facility. Yeah.
Okay.
At this point, the real risk for contamination is during the propagation step, where any contaminant will potentially outcompete the yeast and increase in number. After the propagation step, the risk for contamination is much less significant. So our specs for Lallemand are less than 10 to the 5 wild yeast cells per gram of dried yeast, and that's comparable to liquid yeast producers as well. To get 10 to the 5 wild yeast cells per gram would require you'd have to shake something dirty above the yeast. That would be a very significant contamination, and within our specifications, and that's similar for liquid yeast producers as well. Any commercial yeast has some background of wild yeast and bacteria. That's not just Lallemand. The only way to produce a very pure culture with no contamination is under strict lab conditions, a very small scale. Even in our propagation lab with 10-liter bioreactor propagators that can be completely pulled apart and put in the autoclave, there's still very low background contamination with the wild yeast and things like that. It's just the nature of the game when you're propagating yeast. And putting it into context as well, you put other non-sterile things into your fermenter. You put hops. Hops, while they do inhibit the growth of bacteria, they are not sterile. There's wild yeast and bacteria on your hops, and those are going into your fermenter. And these days, people are throwing them in from right at yeast pitch for New England styles as well. I'll just put it into context there.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Adam Shepard has a question.
Hi, can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, beautiful. So it's just a question around the molasses.
Yes.
Is it better than using LME or sugar solution? Because molasses are quite unrefined as sugar goes, and there's a lot of undigestible sugars in there. So I was just curious, like, why molasses, and also what kind of level of molasses, whether it's a treacle that's a very high quality sugar, or a kind of fancy cooking molasses that have a lot of unrefined and unfermentable sugars.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I believe it's the cheap stuff, and
okay.
that's because it is cheap. It's
Yeah,
a byproduct of sugar production. It's already in liquid form, so it doesn't need to be rehydrated prior to using it in our system. You're correct that molasses does have a lot of other stuff in it. It's a complex mixture, but part of that is nutrition for the fermentations. If you're doing a pure sugar fermentation, you have to add quite a bit of nutrient, and people who have attempted and failed to ferment a hard seltzer have learned the hard way about that. Molasses is more complex, but that's beneficial because it has vitamins, it has minerals, it has things that you would otherwise have to add back to the fermentation in order to make it work.
Well, it might be, but also the fact that if it was kind of a little bit harder to digest for the yeast, does that mean that it just keeps them going a bit slower rather than rocketing up, as it were, like doing a huge amount of fermentation at once? It has to work a little bit harder to get at that sugar.
Yeah, in terms of the complex sugars, yeah, you're right. It won't ferment to 100% attenuation as it would for a pure sugar fermentation. I'd probably have to talk with somebody who works in the production plant to give you a better answer on that. My guess is that it's a cost-benefit analysis. You get good good yeast yields for the lower cost by using the molasses. And again, the great advantage of using molasses is the ability to do a fed batch propagation.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Who's next? Alex Cochran had a question.
Hi guys. Sorry, Chad had a question before me. I don't know if you wanted to go first, Chad.
Oh, just a really quick one. Sure, thanks, Alex. Eric, I was just wondering, you're mentioning you test a lot of those 500-gram bricks
Yep.
and have to open the package. What ends up happening to the rest of the yeast in those bricks?
Part of it goes into retention samples, but the vast majority gets thrown out, unfortunately. But in the context of several tons of dry yeast being produced, we don't have enough local home brewers in the lab that are taking it home. Yeah,
I was going to say, you could send a brick out here. I mean.
Yeah, I think what Chad is saying is he'll give you his address.
Yeah. No, I get it. I get it. I'd like to get more. I've been talking with the exec about getting some more Lallemand homebrew sachets into your hands. So it would be interesting to collaborate on a trial with some home brewers.
Okay, Alex, you want to ask yours?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Eric. Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. So as a home brewer, I don't use diastaticus very often because I'm very paranoid about contaminating my equipment.
Yep.
What are the most effective home brewer accessible sanitizers to robustly kill diastaticus? Are there any? It's actually a hard question to find when you mine the forums.
Yeah, no, I get it. The best way to get rid of it is heat. If you can boil any equipment that you can. In terms of sanitizers, the issue is that it has to be clean before it's sanitized, and if you're able to, if a sanitizer touches something that has diastaticus, if it's not clean first, it could be hidden under biofilms. So I would make sure that you have something that is actually doing some cleaning activity and not just sanitizing. Otherwise, something like Star San is pretty effective.
Yeah. Okay. So I always use PBW to clean
I'm,
before any sanitization. But
yeah, it's been a while since I've been using the homebrew sanitizers as opposed to just hot caustic and paracetic.
Okay.
I'm not really up to date on the finer differences between the different sanitizers. I would put it into context, though. I wouldn't be as concerned about diastaticus as I would for Brett.
Oh,
For
interesting.
example, Brett is more persistent. It's slower growing, and it has more potential to hide. People have been using diastaticus strains, not even knowing what diastaticus was for years. Belgian breweries have diastaticus saison strains in bottled product, and you don't necessarily get bottle bombs all the time with them. I think that the best precaution I would take for a diastaticus fermentation is to make sure you have a good healthy yeast pitch, make sure that you have proper wort nutrition, and be patient. Make sure that you leave it a good long while after it's finished and hit its final gravity to make sure it's not going to leave behind any fermentable sugars.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think there's one more question from Matt.
Hey, just so I guess less technical question. As a brewer, do you have a favorite Lallemand yeast to use to make anything? And if so, do you have any tips or tricks to get the best kind of performance out of it, or the best coax the flavors looking for out of it? Any just personal preference wise, and more anecdotal than lab tested?
I've always been, well, from the R&D work that I've done in the lab, I've been really impressed with performance for the Nottingham strain.
Really?
It is consistently under many different situations the highest performer under stressful fermentations, things like that. It's not an exciting strain per se. It doesn't give you crazy flavors, but performance-wise, high gravity, repitching, fast fermentations, consistency, it's a great option. I'm really excited about our newest strain, the Voss Kvike strain. I think a lot of homebrewers haven't been able to get access to that yet. I'm not sure if anybody has seen that on the shelves at homebrew shops in BC. Anybody use that yet?
Sound off in the chat, I guess.
Okay, so if not, it's coming. Yeah, it's you could ferment it up to 40 degrees with a very neutral flavor profile. And I've even seen some of our commercial trials do kettle sour and fully fermented beer in 48 hours. So it's fast, it's a workhorse, fairly neutral, but with some slight orange peel character to it. It's impressive. Kvike yeast in general is impressive, and it's really nice to have one actually in dry form because that's how it was traditionally stored.
Cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
Anybody else have a question for Eric? If you do, just go ahead and ask it.
I think everybody's muted.
Yeah, they are, but I don't see anybody trying to ask. So
I'll shoot. So,
oh, okay.
Lallemand Diamond, what lager strain was that most closely resemble, would you say?
That's the Weinstefan strain.
Okay, so 3470.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's see, Oost has a question too. Rob, you want to ask?
Just a comment that if we had a meeting in March or whatever that was, I was going to bring a fun blind test where I fermented Nottingham in 3470 at 12 Celsius, same wort, treated as similar as I could, and Karen served me a triangle test multiple times, and I consistently picked the Nottingham, which is interesting because I don't even think Nottingham is listed to fermented as low as 12 Celsius, is it?
I think it goes down to 12 in the
Okay.
TTS. Maybe I'm confusing the numbers. I think it goes down at least to. I think it does go down to 12. I can check that quickly.
I think I might have some packs of Nottingham up in my fridge from Tim from Fraser Mills. I can go check too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Anybody else?
A quick thing just to sort of say, when it comes to gluten-free home brewing, I have a friend who's celiac, and the fact that she asked me to make a 100% gluten-free beer, and looking at all the options out there, your company for Lallemand is the only company that I've found that has a gluten-free yeast option for any home brewing thing, and on a lot of home brewing forums and websites, they do recommend your products. So the fact that you guys make something that is safe for gluten-free home brewing is awesome. And I was able to make a beer that was safe for her and tasty and worked really well. It was awesome. So
it's one of the other great advantages of using molasses instead of a malt-based wort for the yeast production. It is gluten-free. I'm just back to the question about Nottingham fermentation temperature. Yeah, it is listed down to 10 degrees Celsius. It'll be slower, obviously, but this is what I was saying about Nottingham being impressive in terms of the diversity of conditions that you can use it, the diversity of styles you could use it for. It's a very impressive yeast. You can make pseudo lagers by fermenting it cold.
Awesome. Anybody else? Going once, twice.
Yeah, I got one more question.
All right, Matt's got a question.
So when it goes back to dry pitching versus rehydrating, if you're
Yeah.
gonna dry pitch, would you ever recommend like just pitching 2 packs to make up for any kind of lag or stress?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No.
Right from the salesperson's mouth. No, don't buy extra.
Yeah, no, you don't need to. It's, I mean, unless you're doing a very stressful fermentation, very high gravity, or sour beers, things like that. If it's within the range of like, you know, well, there is a pitch rate calculator that we have posted on the Lallemand website. You can Google it, just Lallemand pitch rate calculator. In terms of pitching rates, you can't really use traditional pitch rate calculators that are designed for liquid yeast. These are designed for liquid yeast, and they assume a certain degree of die-off and decreased viability after production. If you use the same calculators for dry yeast, it will result in a very significant overpitch. So it's important to respect we recommend pitching by weight, which is easier anyway. You don't have to count cells. For most ale strains, it's between 0.5 gram and 1 gram per liter. And you don't need to count cells. If you plug our viabilities into a liquid yeast pitch rate calculator, you might overpitch by as much as 6-fold.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, pitch by weight. You don't need to double it up if you are pitching dry. But if you're doing a very stressful fermentation, you might want to consider rehydrating and potentially adding a volume of the beer, of the wort, into the rehydrated yeast, just to gradually acclimatize the yeast to the fermentation conditions.
Cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
So maybe a stupid question, but if you buy a small pack for a home brewer, it's like, what is it, 11 grams or something?
Yeah.
I mostly count the cells, because if I make the recipe, it says, okay, that's the gravity, and then it says the amount of cells, and then I will calculate. So that is not a good idea, or is it?
I would recommend pitching by weight in most cases. It's the important thing about counting cells is to get consistent results from brew to brew.
Yeah.
And if you're using dry yeast, there's no reason why you shouldn't just pitch by weight. It's easier, and you will be able to pitch the same weight into the next batch and get similar results.
But still, if you take it back on the pack for, I don't know, any package, it's like, even if it's 10 or 5 grams, there's the amount of cells inside, right?
Yeah, and this is based on a plate count method.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's this is a whole different discussion, but counting the viability of dry yeast is not trivial. Okay. Because you have to rehydrate it first. If you plate it, the yeast cells may stick together. Yeast cells may appear dead under the microscope, but are completely viable, depending on the staining method that you use. Yeah, from my experience, and I do regularly get questions from commercial and home brewers asking about yeast pitch rates. And they've done the calculations, they've looked at our package and the viability that we have indicated there, which is for most strains greater than 5 billion cells per gram. And calculating using a traditional calculator how much dry yeast they would need. And it ends up being this ridiculous quantity that is, 2 or 3 times more yeast than they actually need, which on the commercial scale, it could be thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And they're surprised by the cost and like, no, just look at the recommended pitch rate for most strains. It's 0.5 gram to 1 gram per liter. For some of our more sensitive strains, the Diamond Lager, for example, is 1 to 2 grams per liter, but that's also colder fermentations. I would recommend checking out the pitch rate calculator. There's also a link on the website to a one-pager document explaining the difference between dry yeast viability and liquid yeast viability. So I encourage you to check that out for more information.
Thank you.
Anybody else? LA, does Aiden have a question?
Aiden has a lot of questions actually, but he's not going to get to ask them. Eric, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned to Graham and I that there was a strain you're working on but not yet released that you wanted to talk a bit about. Was that the Kvike yeast?
Yeah, so we are going to, no, the Kvike yeast is already released. It's been on the market since January. Homebrew sachets haven't hit all the retailers yet, but that will be coming. Yeah, the new strain will be a La Chancia strain that is capable of producing lactic acid as well as ethanol during primary fermentation, which is a great alternative to the two-step kettle sour plus fermentation. It's a single organism that does both, so it saves you money as well. And it's a really interesting flavor profile, stone fruit, as well as the lactic acid sour profile. It's going to be a really interesting strain. Will be released soon. I can't really give details about the dates right now, but I would be interested as soon as the strain is available to send some samples out to you guys to play around with a bit.
Nice.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Let's do that.
Definitely have some people who'd be interested in giving that a try, I think.
Definitely.
VanBrewers loves free stuff.
We do. We're cheap. We also like new things.
Yeah. And we'd love to get your comments on how the yeast performs and things like that. Some of our commercial trials have been put on hold because breweries are locked up right now. So I'm interested in collaborating with the homebrew community to do some of these trials and get some fermentation data, real world performance data. There's only so much you can do in the R&D lab.
Yeah, and it sounds like we've all got a little bit of extra time when we're not panicking about, pandemics and such. So, I mean, we could probably brew something.
Yeah.
Excellent.
My only problem is drinking it all.
Just wait till you can have another party, Steve.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions for Eric, or should we let him go to bed?
My kids usually wake me up around midnight anyway, so I got a little bit of time.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and giving us the awesome presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Actually, just a general question to you guys. Our team in general is doing a lot more online webinars. There's a lot of free lectures out there right now. I was wondering, from a homebrew perspective, is there any specific content that you might be interested in seeing as part of a homebrew-focused webinar?
What I interested in this in the yeast profile. So there's different yeasts. So yeah, some yeast start slowly. So sometimes you're a little bit surprised that you think it's a stop fermentation. So you have slower ones, you have the faster ones.
Yep.
So yeah, I know my yeast that I brewed already with multiple times, but there's yeast I don't know anything about. So yeah, that's something that interests me a lot, especially if you start using this yeast. You said the very versatile one that go in a higher temperature or lower temperature. Well, yeah, I think the R&D, you guys have the information how to use the yeast to have more esters or less esters or faster or slower fermentation.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Yes, I would echo that too. Like maybe pro tips on how to get the most out of a specific strain or something would be interesting to me, because I don't brew enough to use all of them myself.
Right. Yeah, so more of a flavor-based comparison, performance-based comparison of different strains. Okay.
and how to get the most out of them.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, even combining to like I did it's actually a stupid test, or it was actually a missed experiment. So I had a stop fermentation and I threw other yeast inside, but I read the sour book. It's like you start the fermentation and then you stop the fermentation at 1.02 instead of letting it go through, and then add an extra yeast so that the second yeast takes over. So these are really nice projects to have, like make a complexer taste flavor. So that's really cool.
Yep, co-fermentations.
Yeah.
Yeah, my favorite co-fermentation idea is a stepwise inoculation with Nottingham followed by Belle Saison.
Yeah.
So what happens is that the Nottingham consumes all the ferulic acid in the wort, so there's no ferulic acid or very little ferulic acid left for the Belle Saison to turn into the 4VG, the clove character, which is present in most diastaticus yeast. So it gives you very high attenuation without the clove.
What kind of style would you do that?
Kind of a brute-like.
Okay.
If you want very high attenuation, but something where clove would be completely off.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, thank you again to everybody. It's been my pleasure to talk to you guys tonight.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. Yay.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you.